We will hear argument this morning in case 2512.
Grievances we could go into with this system. I think we could be here for hours.
National Collegiate Athletic Association.
I think we have some proof, even a few years into NIL now, that people care about the logo.
There are too many people in power who have no desire to give up that power.
The NCAA's ever-shifting decisions, not stable decisions.
Does the concept of amateurism in college athletics even matter anymore?
They've capped it again without any sort of collective bargaining.
We'll finish with our unilateral decision.
All right. Welcome to another episode of Unilateral Decisions. I am not your host, Dominic Sheldon. He is out for the next couple of weeks, so we will try to fill in on his behalf. Something that's come up every single episode of this show thus far, even early on, is collective bargaining. So we're going to focus this entire episode on the process of collective bargaining and what that might look like, because I believe it is incredibly complicated. So with all of that, Sam, literally what is step one?
Well, step one would be the athletes would want to unionize. That's always obviously the first step because the way it works with the NLRB process is, you have the workers in question fill out a union card, saying, yes, I want a union, no, they want a union. If they have 30% of the workforce saying that they want a union, the NLRB will step in and hold union elections. They'll make sure that, there's limited employer interference. They'll make sure that everything's happening kind of above board, and they'll have the election, and, 50 plus 1%, comes back in favor of the union, then there's a union, and the union is then legally able to demand collective bargaining from the employer. Of course, a lot of steps along that process, just in terms of all these different things that we kind of talk about. And we got, just a couple of years ago, we got a really good look at the process in terms of in kind of the college sports space, or in literally the college sports space, when we saw the Dartmouth men's basketball players unionize, where it was exactly that. We had, more than 30% of the team sign union cards saying we want a union. We had the NLRB step in. We had them hold an election and then vote in favor of unionizing. But of course, the pivotal kind of big question there was that Dartmouth and the NCAA as interveners immediately stepped in and said, you're not employees. You can't unionize under the National Labor Relations Act. And that question, of course, never got resolved. They dismissed their petition as soon as the new president took office, given kind of the shift in the NLRB. They were relying very heavily, obviously, on former NLRB General Counsel Jennifer Abruzzo, who had published a memo saying that she felt that college athletes were union eligible employees. And of course, when the new administration took over, that guidance went away. So, yeah, that would be, again, the process would play out exactly as I said, except for that key part where the NCAA, any schools in question, would immediately challenge the athletes' ability to unionize as only private employer employees are able to unionize, which that, of course, is another barrier here as well.
That's what I wanted to get into, is just sort of the classification that is required in order to even, pursue this opportunity, and how rigid that is versus how much gray area there may or may not be. And based on the current landscape of college athletics, are there barriers to entry as it is currently set up that are beyond just getting enough athletes to organize?
There are significant barriers to entry, and I think that's something that a lot of people underrate. And I think it's, we look at professional sports and we say, well, they can unionize. Why can't we here? And it's a good question. And I think it's a really good parallel. We look at, because there's so many things that the NCAA, that college sports is going through right now that directly mirror, Major League Baseball in the 1960s and 1970s, for example. You look at what happened in Major League Baseball in the 70s, and it's basically exactly what's happening now with, kind of concerns about unrestricted free agency, about, kind of runaway salaries, about all these different things. The key difference, though, is one, there's no question that Major League Baseball players were employees. And two is probably the more kind of challenging aspect here is the fact that the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act, which is the federal law that governs, that gives power to the NLRB, that gives powers to unions to be able to demand collective bargaining, is only applicable to private employers. It's not applicable to government employers, which, if you look at any public university, any state school across the country, those are public employers. Those are government employers. And even if you were to concede that, a University of Alabama college athlete, college football player was an employee, they'd still be a state employee because they work for the University of Alabama, which is a government institution. And that would then entirely depend on state law to determine whether they are an employer. Now, there was a solution proposed to this. Again, former general counsel of the NLRB, Jennifer Abruzzo, had in her memo kind of included as a footnote, and it was something that a lot of sports law scholars kind of took and ran with. The idea that college athletes can be considered joint employers, or college athletes can be considered employees jointly of not only their school, but also of their conferences and even the NCAA, which would, those are private employers. The conferences, the NCAA, are not public entities. They're not government entities. So there'd be no question that they'd be private employers. So potentially you could see a situation where that would allow the NLRB to step in. That would give the NLRB jurisdiction. But again, when Jennifer Abruzzo, now that Jennifer Abruzzo is not the general counsel there, the ability to prosecute that theory is a lot more limited and a lot more unlikely.
So, in its simplest terms, what you're saying is, going back to the Dartmouth case, even if 30% of college athletes, let's take the entire college athlete population, even if they were able to get to that 30% and then triggered the next step, as soon as that happens, there's likely going to be a lawsuit.
Correct. Not likely, definitely, absolutely, 100%. The schools would file a lawsuit, not necessarily a lawsuit, but they file a petition with the NLRB saying, these are not statutory employees, for one, and for two, the NLRB doesn't have jurisdiction over them because so many of them are public employers. And even going beyond Dartmouth, because Dartmouth, Ivy League, private employer, the whole Ivy League, in fact, is private university, so it's private employers. But going back before that, you may remember Northwestern football, back in 2014, 2015, they sought to unionize as well. They actually held a vote on it as well. Though the results from that one were never published, unlike the Dartmouth one. And they originally won at the, there's two levels of the NLRB when we're talking about their judicial system. We have the regional boards and we have the full Washington, D.C. NLRB board. They actually won at the regional level. The regional level said, yes, you are employees. Yes, you can unionize. We're going to allow this election to happen. But Northwestern appealed it to the full NLRB. And I think a lot of us remember, the athletes lost. But I think what a lot of us don't remember is why the athletes lost. The NLRB actually never gave an opinion. They never opined on whether the athletes were employees. They specifically left that question for another day. But what they said is that Northwestern placed in the Big Ten at the time, and still to a certain degree, but at the time it was significantly more disparate. Northwestern was the only private university in the entire Big Ten. Every other school in the Big Ten, Ohio State, University of Iowa, University of Michigan, Michigan State, public universities. And they said, even if Northwestern is a private university, even if these are private employees, if we're going to consider them employees, it would be disruptive to the labor market here. It'd be disruptive to this area of the economic market here if we assert jurisdiction over one of these schools without asserting jurisdiction over the rest of them. If Northwestern is the only school in this conference to be unionized, it creates a mess when we're talking about kind of the labor the labor political economy here. And it's a fair point. And even now, when you see the Big Ten adding schools like USC, which is another private institution, it's probably still not enough where the NLRB would be comfortable stepping in here. So
it would be a mess as opposed to what we're seeing today.
Yeah, well, that's also a mess. That's also a mess, but
it's not their mess.
It's not their mess. Exactly. I think that's a good way of putting it.
So again, hypothetical, pretend this is something that can happen. Would this need to be all NCAA student athletes at once, or could this be sport by sport?
It depends. Classic lawyer answer. It depends. I think it could be sport by sport. I think the best way of doing it is sport by sport, but it really depends on how the athletes want to unionize, how they want to draw their union, how they want to create their union, and also how the NLRB kind of sees it, because the NLRB can step in and say, well, this doesn't represent the entire labor market or the entire class of employees here. They could say that, no, these are separate classes of employees here. These are separate class of workers here. They can even step in and say, well, football players are employees and track and field athletes are not employees. Though with the Dartmouth decision, at least at the regional board, if that carries through, then probably not. They probably wouldn't say that. They probably say that everyone's employees. But defining that union class is going to be a really tricky kind of thing, from both perspectives, because not only from who are we going to bargain with perspective for the NCAA or say the CFP, or you could say, a new entity, the College Sports Commission, whoever you want to say, who are we going to bargain with question is definitely a major question here. But also for the athletes' perspective, larger unions by nature are significantly weaker than smaller unions. And the reasoning is simple. If you look at kind of the divergence of interests, that gets significantly muddled when you're talking about a union that has a ton of different types of people in there, a ton of different types of workers, because a SEC football player is going to have significantly different motivations and interests in terms of what they want to see out of a collective bargaining agreement than a FCS lacrosse player.
I mean, there's parallels to why it's hard to organize.
Absolutely.
With the mass group of people that we're talking about.
Of course.
Right now. I'm curious to dive more into who gets, in this instance, who gets to decide who's an employee. We've talked about the Johnson case and how we expect to hear some resolution on that sometime in our lifetime, I hope. But who gets to decide? You're saying the NLRB could kind of classify here and there, but is it solely their decision, or is it just their decision to take on the potential union? And then there's still an argument about whether or not they're actually employees.
Yeah. So one clarification there: the Johnson case is a case based on the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is not necessarily relevant to, or not at least directly relevant to unionization. It's a different classification of employment law. That's talking about wages and hour, wage and hour law. Whether these athletes are entitled to a minimum wage, which there's a lot of interesting questions around that. But for the NLRA, for the National Labor Relations Act, I will say that the Johnson case will very much inform the NLRA's opinion and vice versa, because you look at the history of kind of when you have kind of these dual kind of lawsuits, when you have questions about employment status under both the Fair Labor Standards Act and the NLRA, a lot of times courts and the NLRB are going to mirror each other. If one decides that they're employees, the other is going to decide that they're employees. It's similar tests, not identical tests, but similar tests. But ultimately, to answer your question, and not just gerrymander, filibuster. That's the word. Not just filibuster.
We're drawing maps over here.
Yeah.
It's a hot topic right now. It's okay.
Gerrymander is a hot topic right now, but not filibuster your question. Yeah. The answer would be, at least to start, the NLRB to decide not only who is an employee, but what the union looks like. Because yes, the union itself would have a lot to do with that question, because they'd say, we want to just be football players, or we want to represent all college athletes, or however they want to do it. But at the end of the day, the NLRB is going to decide who's an employee. The NLRB is going to decide what are the classes of workers that get to unionize, or are appropriate to be unionized together, and they're going to run with that. And the NCAA could appeal it to a federal appellate court. So, maybe that's the answer at the end of the day, but the NLRB's opinion would carry a lot of weight.
Does either side of this conversation, NCAA side, student athlete side, does either side want that question answered, the employment question?
Right now, well, I guess I think there are people within each subgroup that definitely want the question answered. I imagine athletic directors want the question answered, even if they are maybe dreading the answer to the question. They certainly want it answered so they can plan. There are a lot of athletes out there who want the question answered. There are several, plaintiffs in the Johnson case, for example, that are actively seeking the answer to the question. The Dartmouth athletes wanted it, but I think it is kind of important to note that Dartmouth men's basketball is the only group to actually seek union status, even under the favorable NLRB that issued a memo that basically invited athletes to unionize. I mean, we saw stories, and I will make this clear front. We saw stories about, USC athletes wanting or about a petition regarding USC, a petition regarding UCLA, and a petition regarding Notre Dame. None of the three included any current athletes or any athletes at all. They were all kind of put forward by an advocate who wanted to start a union and wanted to include these athletes, but never really. The question never got answered again because they pulled the petition before there was any kind of answer. But also, none of the athletes actually, were part of this petition. It was just kind of this would-be union that wanted the question answered.
Mike, probably for you, if you're a student athlete, I mean, you said it, Sam. Like, there's not been much movement, but if I'm a student athlete, I don't even know where to go. So, Mike, you're probably the most knowledgeable in this space of the three of us. If I'm a student athlete and I want to start this process, who am I calling?
Yeah, there's a few answers. I think that, we've talked previously before, and we've all individually seen some of the work of athletes.org. And that is a resource. Without question, that's a resource. Their approach to it is definitely kind of stratifying the conferences and the sports and trying to find a workable solution and find probably a narrow enough group that they can define something. It comes and goes as far as the momentum that is behind that, for sure. I think, and I have limited experience on the Dartmouth SEIU situation. We actually did work with them on it with the trading cards. We made a set with the Dartmouth men's basketball players under the SEIU label. And the fact of the matter is there's a lot of other unionized labor on Dartmouth's campus. And they had a ton of support within the Ivy League of people who are very, very high ranking within world sports organizations and unionization and players associations. And they had a lot of built-in advantages. And so I think that, the group of athletes at Dartmouth that went forward had the support of very high-ranking officials who, through the channels of other Dartmouth employees and labor unions, they were able to get that forward. There was obviously a desire from at least a couple of the student athletes to really be the ones to figure it out. And I think that moved the needle for them to kind of be one of the first and try to chart a course. But they also had a lot of resources at their disposal. And that can happen elsewhere. There's other universities certainly that are private that have unionized labor forces within the campus. And I think that's a good resource for a lot of student athletes who might be looking to do that. But to Sam's point, there's a lot that aren't, because a lot of public employers are not. And I also wanted to ask, even beyond the public employers, just from a state standpoint, there's some states that hold unions in high regard, some that pretend they don't exist. And so,
beyond even pretend they don't exist, literally outlaw them. There's a lot of states out there that do not allow for public employee bargaining at all. Or if they allow for public employee unionization, they don't allow for things like strikes and kind of the tools of unions to be able to assert leverage.
How about at the private level? Because I know, I hesitate to say what I know, but certainly some states, it's harder still, even for private employers and employees of private employers to find their footing. So what does that look like?
Well, there's not a lot that the states can do necessarily in that area to make it more difficult for private employers. I think at the end of the day, the sole jurisdiction over private unionization, private sector unionization, is with the NLRB, is at the federal level. Any laws at the state level that would make it harder for unions to kind of pop up in the state would be preempted if they are challenged. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Doesn't mean that there are other kind of maybe unseen roadblocks to unionization in certain spaces. Yeah, it would the NLRB would have sole jurisdiction over that for private employers, but But you're right. Like for public employers, that is entirely at the state level. It is entirely a state by state kind of thing, whether they allow public employee unions or not. And a lot of states don't. A lot of states outlaw it completely.
Okay, let's keep playing this out. So we get to the point where we have a vote and more than 50% want to unionize. Getting to the point where that's coming. At that point, there's likely going to be lobbying efforts from both sides saying this is why all of you will want to vote in favor of unionization. And there's going to be groups saying this is why you should be voting, in opposition of unionization. What are each of these groups telling athletes at that point?
Well, first of all, I'll say not necessarily. There is another path here, which to a certain degree becomes more and more likely every day, because you hear it, you hear it being talked about, and that is voluntary recognition. And that does not necessarily require that whole rigmarole. It doesn't require, kind of challenging employee status. It is the NCAA or, whatever organization pops up, greeting the union with open arms and saying, we are happy to bargain with you. We want to get this started. We are voluntarily recognizing you as a union. And there might still be some challenges there, but that is certainly an easier path. And I'll shout out my field colleague Joe Sabin at Southeastern Louisiana. He and I worked on a project along with a couple other field colleagues. A couple years ago, we wrote a paper on the idea that there could be voluntary recognition, and it is certainly a possibility, and it's certainly something that could happen. And as you see more and more athletic directors come out and say collective bargaining is the way forward, it becomes somewhat more likely. But of course, that, for one, I think ultimately that would require, some kind of split away from the NCAA for one or more sports, because the NCAA leadership is adamantly opposed to unionization. And even then, like, a lot of the athletic directors that are saying we want collective bargaining are saying we want collective bargaining, but only if they're not employees. And there's not a legal path of doing that yet. Independent contractor or non-employee unionization is not a thing right now. It has to be something that would have to be carved out by Congress. And we've had a lot of discussions about how hard it is to move a bill through Congress right now. But I apologize. What was your question?
No, so you got
a filibuster opportunity here.
You got into voluntary recognition, but that would come after a vote of like 51% of. Not
necessarily. It could come before it. Yeah.
Okay. So if 30% say we want a union, and whether that's sport by sport, whether that's all student athletes as a collective whole, even before they had a vote, the NCAA could come in and say, no, we voluntarily recognize this.
Yes.
Okay. And then
would they? Probably not, but they could.
I'm still like, I'm trying to be open-minded, I suppose. Collective bargaining without employment status, that being sort of like this almost Trojan horse request. What is the purpose? What would someone think? What would someone believe they understand about collective bargaining and about organized labor that would lead them to say, we want that, but we're not going to classify you as employees?
That's a good question. It's one where I recently, and I'll do another shout out here, another self shout out here. I recently wrote a paper with Northern Illinois professor Neil Turnus about the idea of non-employee unionization and kind of these unions that are not made up of employees and are not technically unions, and whether the NLRA can actually cover them and then whether the NLRB actually controls them is another question. I mean, you do see it in a couple of places. Like we talked about, Seattle recently passed a law where Uber and Lyft drivers could unionize, but they're not employees. They're contractors. So yeah, there's all these kind of challenges and kind of, flimsy kind of things that go along with it. Because ultimately, union status is very much tied to employee status, because at the very least, the collective bargaining agreement has the statutory protections of a federal employment law. It has the Fair Labor Standards Act. It has the Family and Medical Leave Act. It has the ADA, it has Title VII, it has all these different things that, you know, maybe there are some proxies to that, like we have Title IX instead of Title VII, though Title IX only covers sex and maybe gender, and Title VII covers race, national origin, all these other things as well. But ultimately, at the end of the day, those who advocate for non-employee unionization, they want to simplify the process. They want to not have situations where all of a sudden there are massive tax implications to employment. There are a lot of benefits that have to be provided, especially kind of on a state-by-state basis. A lot of states give a lot more benefits to employees. Sure. There's the question of, you know, one big question that came up in minor league baseball recently, when minor league baseball players filed a Fair Labor Standards Act lawsuit and eventually unionized alongside the Major League Baseball Players Association, was overtime. Especially when you're talking about athletes, like how do you pay athletes overtime? Do they qualify under one of the exemptions? Maybe, maybe not. Especially when you're looking at college sports, like you look at even something like the, you know, creative professional exemption, you know, and arguably maybe that applies. There was a question in the minor league baseball case. That was one of baseball's defenses, and never quite got there. But how do you figure out overtime when they're traveling? Like it's all these kind of questions where they're really, really difficult questions to answer. And I totally understand that athletic directors do not want to have to deal with this question. I mean, that's why the word employee is the boogeyman around college athletics right now. But right now, there is not a path to collective bargaining without employment.
Okay. Well, I framed the last question in a manner that ended up getting me lawyered. So I'll rephrase. What I want to get to is, what are the pros and cons of unionization for student athletes?
The pros are stability. The pros are having a seat at the table. Like, and those go hand in hand. Like you're able to have a collective bargaining structure where collective bargaining structures, unlike the House settlement, for example, they are significantly more ironclad. You look at kind of the history of Supreme Court decisions regarding the non-statutory labor exemption, regarding North LaGuardia, regarding all these different labor laws that come into play when you have a collective bargaining structure. And the overarching, I can summarize them all in one sentence: courts stay out of it. And courts abide by that. We have you look at the Brown decision back in 1993 that held that even when you have it was the NFL imposing unilateral restrictions during a work stoppage, those are still protected under the non-statutory labor exception because it's still in the context of labor dispute. Or you look at the Brady decision in 2012 where the NFLPA decertified as a union. And the Eighth Circuit said, well, this is still a labor dispute, so we still have to stay out of it. So it gives that stability that the House settlement doesn't give. It gives that stability where this is a model that the athletes have a legally protected hand in being able to craft that is largely insulated from any kind of attack, any kind of outside attack from anyone. And that ability to help craft the system is not. You can't really undersell that from a large degree. I mean, one thing that recently came up was, and I have my phone out for this reason, Mitt Winter, shout out to Mitt Winter here. The change to the NCAA bylaws, which allows schools to not enter athletes into the portal if a rev share agreement, what a time for my phone to go off. If a rev share agreement releases the school from the obligation, hasn't got enough attention, schools can now essentially prevent athletes from engaging with each other during the portal. And to translate that, for the longest time, and we saw this with Xavier Lucas' situation with Wisconsin, where there's an obligation for schools to enter athletes into the transfer portal if they want to be entered into the transfer portal. The NCAA just changed their bylaws and reversed that, where now if there is a contract that says we do not have to enter you into the portal if you breach this agreement, the schools do not have to enter them into the portal if they breach the agreement. And you combine that with the quote-unquote ghost transfer rule that just came out, that heavily penalizes schools and associated head coaches for accepting athletes who transfer outside of the transfer portal window. That's a situation that heavily decreases mobility for athletes. And you could say that's a good thing. You could say that, I don't like the transfer portal. I don't like the athletes moving around. but it heavily restricts their mobility, and that heavily restricts their earning potential, by the same accord. So that's something that athletes, that's a unilateral decision. Hey, go figure. That's a unilateral thing that the NCAA did, that athletes did not have the ability to bargain. That is something that if the NFL did, the NFLPA would be. That's a bad example. The NFLPA is in a weird spot right now, but that's something that the NBA did. The NBPA would be all over them and be attacking them and be challenging that as an unfair labor practice. And because we don't have unionization, because we don't have collective bargaining, that's something where athletes don't really have a say in it, aside from their very limited voice, kind of through the student athlete advisory committee. So those are the pros. The cons are basically the stability, actually, because right now athletes have found a lot of success suing under antitrust law. They found a lot of success. Not just the athletes, but also state attorney generals on their behalf. They were able to bring down transfer portal. They were able to bring down NCAA rules regarding not being able to negotiate NIL prior to enrollment. They were able to bring down or really, really hurt eligibility rules for a really long time. Appellate court decisions have made that a little more, suspect. Antitrust challenges led to pay for, or I guess it's not technically pay for play, as they call it, but it led to the House settlement and revenue sharing. It led to so many different things that, but that path would be cut off if we have the non-statutory labor exemption, if we have collective bargaining. They would not be able to sue for antitrust law. They would not be able to use that as kind of a resource. And again, going back to the Brady decision, even if they do decertify and want to sue under antitrust law. So that's the major con right there, or that their ability to challenge things would be limited to labor, going through the grievance process, filing ULP charges with the NLRB, that kind of thing. And that is significantly harder to do in a lot of cases.
ULP, unfair labor practice?
Yes. Okay. Sorry about that. Unfair labor practice, ULP.
So, and this could be more of a political question than I intend it to be, but maybe that's the answer. We hear a lot of, the NCAA asking for an antitrust exemption. A lot of people saying that they should have an antitrust exemption. There's a very clear path to an antitrust exemption, which is, allowing the labor to organize. Certainly the employment conversation comes into that. Is that as simple as the answer is, as far as I guess, why would a court or even Congress, for that matter, not simply say to the NCAA, if you don't want to be sued for antitrust, then work with your labor force?
Well, you're presuming that courts have not already said that, and Justice Kavanaugh actually said that. Donald Trump appointed Justice Kavanaugh said in his concurrence to the Alston opinion, hey, you might want to try collective bargaining, which is quite a statement right there. Though he also said any other negotiated agreement, which I don't really know what he meant by that. That's something we unpacked in our article about non-union unions. But anyway, but yeah, I mean, we've seen, and a lot of judges have cited that language from Justice Kavanaugh saying, if you want to not deal with antitrust lawsuits, maybe explore the collective bargaining path. And of course, as we've discussed, that's not necessarily as easy as it sounds. And one thing that Professor Sabin and I kind of left out in our article is that even if you have voluntary recognition, even if the Danny Whites and Jeremiah Dickies and now just today the FAU athletic director said, collective bargaining should have happened 10 years ago. Even if those voices prevail in the NCAA, you still have to convince the athletes to unionize, and you still have to do it in a way where you're not forcing a union upon them. I think, I think the worst thing that could possibly happen for athlete labor is the NCAA says, hey, that student athlete athletic or advisory committee, SAC, that's your union now. We're gonna voluntarily recognize that as your union. We're gonna push you to do that union. And I think that would be a travesty if that happens, because that's there are a lot of really good things about SAC. There are also a lot of concerns about SAC and their relationship with the NCAA, and maybe I'm speaking on things I just don't know about, but because I was never a college athlete, but I've heard from college athletes, including a lot of them who are part of SAC, that it's more of kind of a you're part of the NCAA than an athlete advocacy group, and maybe you guys can speak more to that than I can.
I think that's a fair critique of SAC with respect to it being an organizing, a labor union. I think that's a very fair critique. I think that I also think that SAC has been positioned more or less as an NCAA initiative to give the athletes a voice, which carries with it, kind of an understanding that it's not going to be adversarial. But I think that it could be. I guess it's hard because in my experience, and I don't want to, throw anybody under the bus, but in my experience, SAC is very regularly kind of predictable which student athletes are going to be a part of it and going to put a lot of time and energy into it. And very predictably, it is not the same athletes who the general public thinks wants a bunch of protections right now. And so to convince the people who are, maybe most at risk, I think that with the employment and collective bargaining conversations specifically, because I do think there are a lot of, we've talked before about, sports that are at risk of getting cut, sports that are at risk of becoming non-scholarship, sports that are at risk of losing a lot of the non-monetary benefits that college athletes are provided. Yeah. Yes, a lot of those sports are represented heavily on a lot of traditional SAC boards with people that are interested and engaged. And there's something to be said for that. But the public discourse around collective bargaining is generally around football, men's basketball, to a lesser degree, women's basketball. And by and large, you are not getting incredibly engaged people from those sports participating in SAC. So SAC would have to be more or less rebranded on a lot of campuses in order for you to get that type of involvement, that type of engagement, and for the discourse to even turn that way. This probably segues into a whole different part of this conversation, and maybe we'll go there. But as far as breaking away, as far as those sports choosing to take their own path, and I think that you could end up seeing SAC be this body for the sports that are not part of that conversation. And while it is perhaps, an NCAA-led initiative, I think that I do think that there's a lot of people willing to listen to what the student athletes bring forward from SAC more today than they were 20 years ago, for sure. And so I think that there's an opportunity there. I think you have to make sure you're getting the right voices in the room. And I think you have to make sure that it is politics. You got to play the game. And it's hard to play the game when you're only there for a couple of years.
Yeah, that's the biggest problem right there. Or one of the biggest problems.
It absolutely
biggest problems, but
it absolutely is.
Definitely a big problem. And I will say, my concern with SAC is just more about their independence. It's more about are they actually a distinct entity that, is not just kind of, because you look at, for one, the Clayton Act specifically defines as an unfair labor practice, the employer's funding the union in any kind of way. Yeah. And that's a problem with SAC right now. Yep. So that's just as a starting point in terms of that independence. And I think you said it perfectly, just in terms of who is on the board of SAC and who is actually being discussed in these collective bargaining discussions. Yeah.
And we talked about it briefly in one of our previous episodes, and it's a whole episode unto itself. But, the idea of where that labor force could organize and who would be the employer if you were to actually put this on some sort of level playing field. You go back to the Northwestern decision that you talked about. They didn't feel like they could treat one differently than the other. And as long as all of these athletes are independent contractors for the time being of a bunch of different state entities, a bunch of different private entities, I don't see that happening. I don't see there being a way for them to, coalesce and move forward with really these level of protections. And so the opportunity to do so is with a third party. And I've talked about it before. I feel like it's the CFP. I think that that's the group that can do this for football specifically. And that you mentioned tangled web. That leads to a bunch of problems of untangling potentially the NCAA tournament, which is back in the conversation with expansion, which is for money, which is why it's so important to the whole enterprise. And so, yes, detangling college football would be very difficult, but we've talked about it for 6 years at least, that one of the solutions that was likely to come out of all of this is essentially a licensing arrangement with the universities rather than the universities having control over the players. The university then licenses their marks, their field, their, practice facilities, their traditions, what have you, to this third party entity that runs the actual sport of, the organization itself, the club at that point. The players are employees of that club. That's the path that still 6 years later makes the most sense in my head. I understand it is not simple, but none of these things are simple. No. And so I feel as though everything even about this conversation that we've just had points you to, well, there's no easy answer. There's no immediate answer. What is the best answer? And I know that goes back to what you've talked about as far as like get in the room, spend a year talking about it, all sides. You just got to find the best answer, and you have to have conviction behind approaching the best answer, because there's not an easy answer. There's not a quick fix. There's not a Band-Aid that you can put on it that's not going to be challenged in the courts.
Yeah, of course. And, to your point, I do wonder, and maybe this is part of the CFP thing, but I do wonder if perhaps conference by conference collective bargaining is maybe a future here where one conference, and doesn't even have to necessarily be the Big Ten or the SEC. I mean, even looking at the Pac-12, for example, they're seeking to kind of position themselves as kind of doing things different and being very future minded. Maybe they, come to the opinion where it's like, we're going to do our own thing. We're going to voluntarily recognize our athletes as employees. We're going to do it in the way we want to do it. And we're going to, we're going to position ourselves differently. We're going to, kind of chart our own path here. Of course, the NCAA would immediately have a fit and probably expel them, but at least it starts the ball rolling. And I mean, when's the last time the NCAA threatened to expel a whole group of schools? Well, it was all the schools in California when California passed the Fair Play to Play Act, because, those schools were, being pushed to or forced to allow athletes to monetize their NIL. And I forget, maybe I'm forgetting something, but I don't think the schools were ended up getting expelled. I think, the NCAA ended up ceding ground there.
Yeah. And maybe I'm jumping to conclusions, and, I look at like, maybe the path is, much like baseball, the American League, the National League, and eventually there becomes major leagues, just like the NFL, the AFL, eventually there's a merger. I mean, maybe you have to follow that same, exactly. Maybe you have to follow the same path, even though it feels like you should be able to look at history and say, like, let's just cut to the chase. But maybe you do have to follow that same path. And maybe that means it's conferences before anything else. And I think that's highly possible. It does lead to a question I did have for you about what does that look like with the player movement that we've, come to expect at this point. Let's say there are conference level collective bargaining arrangements. What does that look like? And I'm sure there are different answers, but what can it look like? Let's just pretend that the SEC has organized and the Big Ten has organized, and there are athletes who want to move between them, or there are athletes who want to enter one of those who were previously in the Mountain West or Conference USA or what have you. How is the process of that different than what we look at today?
It's a really good question, because even with collective bargaining agreements at a conference level, it's not like the conferences could say in the collective bargaining agreement necessarily that, well, you can't go to the other conference. I mean, this was pre-collective bargaining agreement, if I remember correctly. We did have a situation where Rick Barry, famous NBA player, he actually had to sit out a year because in the middle of actually pretty early in his career, because he was contracted to play for, I don't remember exactly which ones. I think the Golden State Warriors were actually involved in there. But he was contracted to play for an ABA team. He decided, or maybe it was the other way around, but it was between the ABA and the NBA. He was contracted to play for one team. He decided to go to the other conference for more money, and his previous team filed a lawsuit and said, you are not able to contract jump. You're still under contract with us. We control your exclusive rights, and that's that. And the court issued an injunction, and the injunction basically said you will either play for the team you contracted for originally, or you'll play for nobody. And he chose to play for nobody. That is potentially a thing that could happen if you have, and that's not even a thing that necessarily requires collective bargaining agreements. I mean, that's something, again, I'm not 100% sure even that, the NBA or the ABA were under collective bargaining agreements at the time of this court case, but I'm pretty sure they weren't. But at least it would be significantly more enforceable if you did it through collective bargaining, especially if you're going to do a thing, especially if you're doing the thing that the Big Ten is doing right now, and they're having model contracts across the entire Big Ten, because that creates antitrust issues right there if you're having the entire Big Ten. And that gets into whether they actually control a significant chunk of the market and all that different things. But still, there's problems there. There's potential problems there. And if you have a collective bargaining agreement, that becomes significantly more enforceable.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, it can't be done because, one, I mean, the questionable enforceability part of it, but also two, because the NCAA is very much leading the directions here. You can't have in your contracts that you're reserving the exclusive playing rights of the players, because these contracts are not pay for play. At least they're as written, not pay for play. But that's what the University of Cincinnati is going to deal with Brendan Sorsby. And of course, Brendan Sorsby has other problems right now, but that's something that came into the conversation with the Darian Mensah case and with the Damon Williams case. And any other time we're going to see lawsuits filed by clubs against, the similar kind of thing as the Rick Barry situation, clubs filed by former players who transfer away, even to another conference. That's always going to be the question here. And acknowledging the employment status of these players, acknowledging that these contracts are pay for play, solves so many problems.
Okay. We can't get an antitrust exemption. The answer is collective bargaining. But the second that process begins, there's a lawsuit. It's going to be challenged. And then even if it continues to progress, college football breaks away. I mean, this is the most complicated, this is the most complicated thing in the world.
It is not an easy path, that's for sure.
Which is why nothing has been resolved.
Yeah.
So
how much of the complication is because of how it's always been? Or
Like
is
a
this
lot of it.
always going to be, even if you were starting a brand new NCAA, you wouldn't call it that. Even if you were starting, you were taking, I don't know, say there was a coalition of small liberal arts schools that had never hosted athletics before, and a private equity group wanted to just start from scratch and put them together. Is this still this complicated?
Probably not, because you can start from the, you could start from the reality that we're going to treat them as employees, and there's not going to be as much resistance to it because, well, they're student athletes and they have always been student athletes. Even if you look at the history of the term student athlete and you realize that the term student athlete was created to avoid workers' compensation lawsuits in California and Colorado. Very successful. Walter Byers, has written a lot about that in his memoirs. But no, I think so much of it is our perception of who college athletes are, and the fact that we use the term student athletes. We think about them as students there first. We ignore the fact that so many students, like graduate students, can be employees and often are employees of their institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Work-study students are employees of their institutions. And we see this idyllic version of amateurism that, involves college athletics being just a extracurricular activity, where they're just students and they're students first and they play sports on the side. But that's not the reality when you pare back kind of those rose-colored glasses. And yes, I think if you're starting from scratch, you don't have the rose-colored glasses. You don't have that nostalgia, and you're able to acknowledge the reality of what you're building.
It just feels like that's part of the answer.
Might be.
All right. Unilateral decision time. I'll hit Mike first.
Oh.
And then Sam. And then if I feel like it,
you have to answer.
I'll answer.
You have to answer.
Way
as well.
too quiet today.
I'm listening. I'm learning. My head hurts.
This is the episode you've wanted.
It is. I've wanted to talk about this for a long time because it's so complicated. Like, it's just, we need this. We can't have that. Then you need this. Well, you can't. It's like, it's crazy. Okay. If you were a student athlete, would you want to unionize?
Yeah. If I was a student athlete, I would want to organize with the group of people that I felt I was most like. And I know that's a lot of caveat there, but I would. If I felt like I was in position, and I mentioned earlier, the hard part is the fleeting element of being a college athlete, because this all takes time, as we've talked about. But I would want to, if I was a football player, I would want to organize with fellow football players at a certain level that are trying to accomplish the same things. And that's a hard part of labor organization, no question. But I think that it's easier to get to common ground. And by the same token, if I was an athlete that was at jeopardy of our sport being cut or being completely neutered with scholarships and things like that, I would absolutely want to organize, because I wouldn't want everything I had worked my entire life for to be at risk just because somebody on my campus has to find a way to pay the quarterback more money. And I think that's a very real opportunity right now for a lot of schools to say, well, we've got some hard choices to make. I would want to organize if I was a student athlete in a position where I felt like my sport was in jeopardy. And I don't like being in a position of, operating out of fear, I guess, which kind of sounds like some of that is. But at the same time, you got to take the power position. Otherwise, it's going to, the power is going to be bestowed upon you. And I just, but I wouldn't be that sport also trying to go and get the football team rallied up to try to organize with me. And I think that's a hard thing, but I think it's real. And I just think that that's the world we live in right now. And college athletics is having to learn to live in that world, and college athletes are having to learn to live in that world. And so, yes, I unilaterally would choose to organize. Who I organize with would depend on what sport I was playing and what the position was on campus. But I believe that there's benefit to organizing for all different parties if you can find the same class.
Sam?
If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have said absolutely not. If you'd asked me a week ago, I would have said probably not, but my position might be changing. Now my answer is yes, I would. Because for one, and this goes to the year ago part of what I just said, the way that these appellate court decisions have run in terms of the eligibility cases, the Nicer for Kurian case, the Jet Elad case, the Jamori Robinson case, and the Ninth Circuit cases, Noah Blythe, Tata Martinson, and Cortez Bram. The Ninth Circuit cases haven't come out yet, but we can tell from oral arguments and from what the Ninth Circuit did with Noah Blythe and overturning the preliminary injunction even without the order. Or without the opinion, we know how they're going to rule, and they're going to rule the exact same way the other courts did. And the way the other courts ruled is not necessarily a bad thing for athletes. The courts made very clear that the eligibility rules are ripe for review. They are commercial in nature. They are subject to the Sherman Act. However, they dramatically increase the evidentiary burden that is required for these challenges, where it is now not as simple as file a lawsuit and within a month you're going to be eligible. In some cases in state courts that may be the case, but for these antitrust cases in these federal courts, there's a much higher evidentiary burden now. And the reason why that matters is not just for eligibility, but also because I would, from reading those cases, I would fully expect that those cases go beyond eligibility into other antitrust challenges against the NCAA, including their new eligibility rules, of course, and the new 5-for-5 rule and the age rule, of course, and also things like transfer rules and stuff like that. And the rule that I just outlined, which is that schools can, voluntarily say, based on the contract, say, we're not going to enter you in the transfer portal. And if we don't, then whatever school takes you is going to be at risk of losing their head coach for half a year and all these different things. And that is normally something that would be absolutely right for antitrust to review. With these appellate court decisions, I'm not so sure. I mean, I think they're still winnable, but it would take a lot of time and money to win those cases. And, for athletes who have short careers, that's time and money that they don't necessarily have. And you look at the way the NCAA is operating right now. You look at the way that a lot of programs are operating right now. And something I neglected to say, and I'm glad, Mike, you've picked up on this. In terms of the pros and cons of unionization from the athlete's perspective, dropping sports, absolutely a mandatory subject to bargaining. Expansion, absolutely a mandatory subject to bargaining. When the NFL went to 17 games, it was a subject to bargaining. The NFLPA had to approve it. The NFL had to give concessions to the NFLPA to get them to approve it. So going to 24 teams in the CFP, for example, or going to 76 teams in the NCAA basketball tournament, those are mandatory subjects to bargaining where the players could say, You're lengthening my schedule. You're requiring us to play more games. You're taking us out of the classroom even more. You're subjecting our bodies to even more risk of injury. What are you going to give us in return? Mm-hmm. And I think, Matt Brown has been, of Extra Points, has been kind of the one who's really kind of pushed back on a lot of people, including me, who have said, why on earth would the athletes bargain? And he's pointed out that for about 1% of the athlete population, that's a correct statement. That why on earth would they bargain? They already have everything they want. But for the other 99%, there's a lot of reasons. There are health and safety things that they can get through collective bargaining. There's scheduling reforms that they can get for collective bargaining, and overall, just get a hand on the ship, on the steering wheel, which right now they only have to a very limited degree. So, yes, the answer is yes. And again, my answer would have been a lot different even a week ago, but I'm fully converted at this point to yes. I think unionization would be a good move for college athletes.
You guys summed it up. I'll answer just because I always do. I agree wholeheartedly. I think I've been a pretty big proponent of stability on this show, and I think that's the beginning of stability. And if I'm a student athlete, I want stability, and I also want a seat at the table, much to what you were talking about. I want to have a voice in all of these conversations. So if I'm a student athlete, absolutely, 100%. So, yeah. All right. Well,
with that,
not that complicated after all.
No. Yeah, but as soon as I'm an athlete, we vote, we get 30%. Well, we're gonna challenge this in court.
You guys can't do that because you're not employees, and then we got to wait to see how that shakes out. So everything's complicated. Nothing's easy.
Oh yeah,
it's not easy sitting in this chair either. So I am
gives us stuff to talk about.
I am still not your host, Dominic Sheldon.
Or Joe Nickel.
I'm Joe. That's Mike. That's Sam. Appreciate you guys tuning in. That's it for Unilateral Decisions. We'll see you next week.